Right. Yeah, thank you. Sure. We're going to be moving on to our next talk this evening. Hands up, has anyone here, hands up who's used Pulse News? Wow, that's pretty awesome. So, anyone who's done any Android development knows what a pain in the ass getting your app to look right on a whole variety of screen sizes. That's everything from like a posted size Xperia Mini to a kind of surfboard size Toshiba tablet is. I think, one of the big achievements that Pulse News has done is creating a newsreading app that looks really great on Android. I can't think of an app that looks better on it. And also looks really amazing on iOS as well. It has a great design that scales across all these different form factors. It's one of my favorite news reading apps, and I think it's really interesting as a technical story. And I'm hoping that Albert and Jean will do us an awesome talk about what it went into making both the design and the application. So without further ado, the guys from Pulse News. There you go.
Thank you.
So just to introduce ourselves, Albert and Jean, and we lead up the Android team at Pulse, which is currently 4 people. So Albert was actually the first hire at Pulse. He started early last year, and I started last November. So we just wanted to share a little bit about what we've learned in the past year, half a year to a year, and here's my shameless plug for Pulse on all our devices. So this is our new sort of slogan, which is Pulse takes your favorite websites and transforms them into a colorful and interactive mosaic. And even more shameless plug is that we're hiring for iOS and web. So now we'll move on to the actual. Oh, and also, I guess just a little bit of history. We launched mid last year, first on iPad, and then about a month later released an iPhone app, and about a month later released an Android phone app, and then earlier this year we worked with the Android team to optimize it for Honeycomb and other tablets. Now we're across all. So Albert's going to tell you a little bit about general design tips and guidelines that we tried to keep in mind.
Okay. So the basic format of the talk is we're going to start the less technical and slowly get deeper and deeper into the more technical. So hopefully everyone will find something very interesting in this talk, no matter what sort of technical person you are. And so the first.
I forgot to ask how many people are doing Android development.
Oh, so how many people here are doing Android development? And iOS? Both? Awesome. Alright, cool. So when designing an application for a tablet, there are a lot of apps out there, especially Android apps, that kind of take the app that they have for the phone and think that they can just kind of blow it up and everything will be peachy. But unfortunately, that's not really the case. And one of the main reasons is that a tablet is like a completely different experience than a phone. And first, I like to preface this part with, and a developer tells you something that's impossible, they're lying. So if you're a designer and you say, you want this interaction, at Pulse we kind of believe that where there's a will, there's a way. So with enough creativity, you can make almost anything happen, especially since these devices are really, really advanced. If you took them back to the 1980s, people would think you're some sort of wizard. And so you can probably cook up something that would create, make any sort of design come to life on tablets. And so yeah, they're completely different experiences. They're way bigger. People use them in different places. When you're on a phone, you kind of use it when you're waiting in line, or if you're just in between having downtime. Whereas on tablets, it's something more dedicated. You're sitting on the couch, you're at a coffee shop, or you're sitting in bed. And you have to take into account all these different contexts that users are in when you design your app for a tablet. And never trust the system to do a human's job. So Android has this capability where they can scale your phone app to fit a tablet size. I think it's in Android 3.2, but I would advise everyone against from using that because everything gets blown up. The buttons look kind of oversized and pixels get blurry, and it's a much better experience if you kind of design your own tablet version of the app just to make sure that everyone has the proper experience. So one basic tip is dialogues can keep your app from looking silly. So we have a login dialog in Pulse where you can log into Twitter. And when we first started using Honeycomb, this is what it looked like. It looks kind of ridiculous, like the style of the username and password stretches across the entire screen. There's a whole lot of nothing going on. There's a tiny login button, and it just looks like pretty ugly, to be honest. And since we're really unhappy with this, we decided to make it into a dialogue on Honeycomb tablets. So there, everything's more compact. You get the context of where you are in the app still, where you're logging in. So in this case, I was reading a story and I wanted to share on Twitter. So I take Twitter, a pop-up appears. And I'll get into later on how we can have this sort of different experience on both tablets and phones while still having the same APK. And I'll be covering that later. But for now, just use your screen size as appropriate. So if it only requires a couple of things, turn it into a dialog box. Otherwise, use the full screen. And users rotate tablets. A lot of app developers kind of fall into the trap where they just design for portrait mode, because that's what a lot of the phones are. People typically hold their phone in portrait mode unless it's on the keyboard. And the truth is that there's all these different use cases for tablets, and since there's a lot of those cool tablet stands, then people like to hold it sideways, upright, and however you wish. So in Pulse, we have a different reading mode for landscape versus portrait. So in portrait, we just have the text fill the entire thing, so it's kind of like a sheet of paper. But in landscape mode, if we stretched out the text to be all the way across, it actually became really hard to read because your eye would just have to travel the entire length of the tablet and to get fatigued. So we decided to use half the space to navigate the stories. So you kind of browse other sources and stories while you can still read whatever story you're interested in. And so this way you kind of play to both user preferences. And it turns out users have a pretty strict adherence to whatever they don't like. Like some people only use it in portrait, and some people only use it in landscape, and they'll fight you if you tell them otherwise. And also, tablets can be used on both handheld and on a table. There's all these sorts of different cases that are built for tablets to just kind of stand on their own. And you have to design for both use cases. An example of Pulse is we tried to build thumb-friendly navigation. So if you're holding a tablet in your hands, your thumbs can only stretch so far unless you have freakishly large thumbs. So we decided to keep the buttons near the corners. So on the bottom right is our navigation. And we also have buttons on the top left, so if it's sitting on a table, it's easy to poke at if it's on a coffee. And you're sitting in a coffee shop, you can just kind of poke at the screen, whereas if you're holding it in your hand, you still do all the basic functionality. Okay. And now we're going to get into some more technical stuff. So in Android, when you lay out your application, there's linear layouts, relative layouts, and absolute layouts. And what we've found is that relative layouts are probably the best layout to use when you're designing for multiple screen sizes. And that's because you can do cool things like align elements to parts of the screen. So here is our tutorial, where we kind of introduce the user to Pulse and all the functions in the application. And using some very, very basic rules, we managed to use the same layout for any orientation and screen size. So this is on a phone in portrait mode. We just align that top left, this one center vertical, and bottom center. And using these same rules on a tablet, it looks and functions almost the same way, and we didn't have to change a thing. So by just laying out your XML files in relative layouts and being kind of planning ahead of time where you're going to place these elements, it can kind of build an app for almost any screen size that would stretch in any orientation you wish. And also, I'll define a tablet as kind of like neon yellow because you're not really sure if it's a really small phone or a really big phone or a really small tablet. And this is the new Galaxy Note, I think. It was announced a couple days ago. It's going to be like a 5-inch device. And I'm not really sure if it's like a tablet or a phone. The resolution is the same resolution as the monitor on my MacBook, so it's pretty crazy. However, Android provides us with these cool resource holders to kind of drop these devices into certain buckets. So starting from Android, I think 1.6 and beyond, they have resource folders for regular size, which is like phone, large, which is somewhere between 5 and 7 inches, and extra large and 7 and above, and along with a density screen. And using these folders, you can kind of put your layout files or like image assets, so you know that the proper layout is used by the proper device. So this is an example. So going back to the dialog box, we have a different style file in each one of these folders. So we have a style called conditional dialog. We set it for an activity. So in the regular values folder, we have this theme file, and this is just a regular theme, nothing special. But when we put it in the extra large folder, we inherit the dialog theme. So basically that activity becomes a dialog on extra large devices. So it takes up the entire screen on regular phones, but when you put on a tablet, it shows up in a dialog box. And that's one of the tricks we use to kind of have the same file, but have it applied to multiple devices. And we apply this trick to a lot of our layouts so if you want a certain look on phones, you put it in the regular folder. And if you want a certain layout on tablets, you put it in the extra large folder. But sometimes you need to know what size device you're on in code, because there's no easy layout folder for your code. You just have your code and that's it. So where you do this, we use the layout folders to our advantage again. So let's say we have a layout, and we just include this file. And that file is different So this file is different in, this is the regular layout folder, so this applies to phones. We have an ID called screen size normal. And this exact same file in the large folder, we call the ID screen size large. So in the code, you can just check if this view exists. And whether it exists or not tells you if you're on a tablet or not. So on tablets, you will be able to find this screen size large element. And so if it's not there, it means it's not a tablet. And you can use that to flip your code, like if tablet, do this, if not tablet, do that. This is a good way to tell if it's tablet or not. And before, we actually tried doing some other heuristics to tell if it's tablet that turned out to be terrible ideas. Like have pixel width, like, oh, 600 pixels, that's got to be a tablet. Then the Atrix came out for just like 540, and then the new Note's coming out, and that's like 800 pixels wide. So you can't really rely on these rules that you make up as you go along. So using the folders is kind of a foolproof way. We haven't run into any issues yet, but perhaps we will. And there are no magic numbers. Like under any circumstance, don't have like numbers in your layouts. Like padding is 10. Like don't do that. Use the dimensions in integers XML files so you can separate them into the 3 folders that you keep expanding it from. Because it'll look funny if you have the same number across all devices. That's almost a guarantee. And never scale up assets because they'll be blurry. So that's just a note. And for the trickier dimensions, where you don't know what it's going to be when you're actually writing the code. So for the numbers that you put in those files, like for small times 10, large times 20, etc. But for ones that are more dynamic, you're kind of stuck. And an example in Pulse, we want the width of a tile to be 1/3 of the screen width. And we also cap it, but that's something else. So when you don't know this width of the screen when you're writing the app. So what we do is we have like a singleton helper class that just calculates all the necessary like dynamic values when you first load the app. So you just take the screen width, take the min, the width, and the height, and divide it by 3, and there we have our file size. And we use that number pretty much everywhere in our app. So it's just somewhere you can always access it, and it's very easy to use. Now I turn over to Jean, who will go over some honeycomb specifics.
Oh, to the next one.
Oh.
Hold on. Is this yours?
Oh, that's just come at the end.
Okay, this is supposed to say backwards compatibility. So
Okay.
pretend it says that. This is my cat. Okay, so backwards compatibility. So in addition to thinking about like all these different screen sizes and dimensions and densities, you also have to think about making it backwards compatible with all these different API levels. So every 6 months or so, Google puts out a new version of Android, Froyo, Gingerbread, Honeycomb, coming up Ice Cream Sandwich, and it's very exciting. It's always like the best and the newest and like the coolest mobile technology, and it's very tempting to want to like upgrade your app to include all these things. But the truth is like not many users are going to be on it, so you really want to be pretty selective about what you add to your app, and because you also have to think about making it backwards compatible. So backwards compatibility, what happens in Java and on Android is like, is if you have, so if the API introduces a new method, and so for example, they introduce this apply method for shared preferences. If you introduce it in a later API, if you try to just run it in, like an earlier device, it gives you like a verification error or verification error, because what it'll do is the verifier will run at like runtime, and it'll check to see if all these methods exist, and at a lower API level, it doesn't exist, and so it'll crash. And so there are a few ways to deal with this. So the first one is reflection. Oh, wait, going back. So shared preferences, in case you guys are not familiar, is basically just a very basic like local storage for Android. So if you have anything like preferences or like just default, like Boolean flags that you want to set, or anything that is just like key value pairs you want to keep around, shared preferences is a good place to put them. And so before API level 9, what they had was commit method. And when Gingerbread came out, they said, okay, everyone, you should use this apply method. It's like so much better, it's like your app will run faster. So, but how do you use it, right? So this is sort of a simplified version. But basically, reflection is, instead of calling .apply, what you do is you get the method and you pass in the name of the method as a string. And so it's actually dynamically, resolving that. So if the method exists, M will become the method, and if it doesn't exist, it'll be null. So then in your code, when you actually want to save something to shared preferences, if it's not null, you're at API level 9 or above, and you just do invoke on the method, and you pass it to editor. So instead of editor apply, it's method invoke with the editor as a parameter. Otherwise, you fall back to whatever it was you were doing beforehand. So reflection is a pretty common way to do this thing. You can write utils and stuff for this. Another way is writing a wrapper class. So the thing is, classes don't get loaded and verified until they're called the first time. So if you have like a wrapper class, you can wrap that functionality, and then you can check to see if that method exists at the API level, and if it doesn't, you just never call the wrapper class. So it never gets loaded, it never gets verified. And I didn't really go too deep into the code because there are lots of examples online. So if you find yourself having to do this, just Google Android backwards compatibility, and I guarantee the first one will be like the official Google, official Android documentation on how to do this, which is very good. Okay, so earlier this year, we worked with the Android team to sort of optimize our app for Honeycomb. And we started out we jumped like really deep in. We were so excited to add like action bar and like fragments, which I'll cover later. And in the end, we actually didn't use anything Honeycomb specific, but there are a lot of things you can do to optimize your app so it looks good and performs well on Honeycomb devices that are just things to keep in mind, and things that are not super deep dive into Honeycomb specific features. So this is, oh, the first one shouldn't be there, but okay, if you have like 5 minutes and you want to optimize your app for Honeycomb, this is all you need. You just need to add, on your Android manifest file, all you need to do is add Android hardware accelerated equals true. This turns on hardware acceleration, and the first time we did this, it was on a Motorola Zoom, and everything was like much snappier, like the scrolling was awesome. So like the very basic level of optimization is just turning on hardware acceleration. Okay, and then once you set your target SDK version to point to a version of Honeycomb, you'll notice that your menu button doesn't exist anymore. So if you guys are familiar with like Android phones, there's like the hard menu button, but then on Honeycomb, they've actually taken away like the hardware buttons and replaced them with on-screen buttons that are always there. And I guess maybe they realized that no one really looks in there, like average users maybe like don't know to go in there. So anything that's really, you want your users to use should be more in their face. So it disappears. There's sort of a workaround to get it to show up again. Like I think if you don't set your target SDK version to Honeycomb, or you set the build, or there's some way to do it, but like you can leave it there. Like we left it there for a release or two, and then we decided that like Android, they're trying to train their users to sort of get used to like a certain convention, and then we wanted to sort of respect that. So we sort of revamped our action bar, or like, so the top bar is, we've had that for a while, and you can tell it has like some actions on the top. So Honeycomb has a very, and I guess Android in general has a slightly different convention for where they want you to put like your actions and stuff. So this is actually an unreleased sneak peek at our new redesign, which is like halfway done. But this is sort of like in line with the Honeycomb conventions, where the logo is aligned all the way to the left, and then all your actions are on the top right. And of course, you don't want to like overwhelm your users with like 6 or 7 actions. So what you do is you choose like the most important ones, and then you hide the rest in this overflow button. So they click on it, it drops down. And yeah, so actually, it says BYO action bars because this is actually not using like, so Honeycomb has like a default built-in like action bar functionality, and you have to turn it off if you don't want it. So we've actually just built our own because we want it to be compatible with phones and tablets. Ice Cream Sandwich, which is the upcoming release, is supposed to like merge phone and tablets. So you should be able to add action bars and have it work across all devices when that comes out. But currently we have our own action bar, and yeah, so there it is. You'll probably see it in the store in like a month or 2 weeks. So people talk a lot about Android fragmentation. They complain a lot about it, but this slide is about fragments, which is one of the main features of Honeycomb. It's basically, I sort of think of them as like baby activities. Activities usually take up a whole screen. Fragments are sort of designed so that you can have multiple on the screen and they can interact with each other. So in this case, for Gmail, on the left side, your list of folders is one fragment, and then I assume this is how they built it. And then on the right, it's your inbox. So then if you click on the names that this fragment, then it changes like what it's displaying. So fragments are really good for taking advantage of the extra real estate that tablets give you, and at the same time they're backwards compatible. So after they released Honeycomb, maybe a few months after, they made it, they released like a compatibility library. So if you use that, it should be compatible all the way back to version 1.6. We actually are not using fragments right now because when we first optimized for Honeycomb, the compatibility library was not released yet. But that's sort of on our refactoring to-do list. Okay. I also wanted to talk a bit about APKs. So APKs are just the format that the file you install on your phone and what you upload to Android Market. When we first started working on Honeycomb stuff, we took such a deep dive into it that we thought we'd have to release it separately. We could branch the code and make all these changes. And like at the last moment, we sort of decided, this is a huge decision because we're going to have to maintain it indefinitely. So actually, the Android Market, like a few months ago, this is after our decision, they announced support for multiple APKs. So what that means is that previously you could only have one APK tied to like your app on the Android Market. So now you can have as many as you want. And so you can have like, if you had a phone APK but you wanted to release a Honeycomb APK that's super optimized for Honeycomb, you can like upload another APK, and then when someone has a Honeycomb device and installs it, they'll get the appropriate APK. So it's sort of tempting to do that because I think at first it's easier because you just branch it and then you change like whatever you want, and then it's just nice to like ship it out. It's not really great for maintaining the code. So the suggested route is to have one APK. You can tell it is a super awesome option. It's better for like several reasons. One is just better maintainability. You don't want to like have to change a feature here and then merge it into this other thing, and just have to worry about like all these things you have to do before you release a new version. So I would advise, if at all possible, to keep it as one APK, because then you just have one code base to maintain. The one exception is, I guess, this is what I read on their documentation, but like really the only reason is if your APK is over 50 megs and it's because you have like all the resources for like all the different screen sizes, and for some reason it's so ginormous that it's over their limit, and then you should split it up. And the final thing, I guess, I saved the best for last, is we talked a lot about different screen sizes, different API versions, but really at the end you just have to test. Like you have to test on every device you can get your hands on, like every API level, every carrier, manufacturer, like they all have their own skins, and like you can use the emulator for APIs, but like carriers, manufacturers do all this like random custom stuff that usually using the device is better for like being in sync with what your users are actually seeing. Some things we've actually done. So every time a new device comes out and we get bugs on it, it's like, well, we're not going to like go buy every device, right? So we've actually gone to like the brick and mortar, like AT&T, Verizon stores in the middle of the day and just said like, hey, can we like test here? And Albert's actually like brought his laptop and like plugged it in. So
they're usually really nice about it.
yeah, it's in Palo Alto, so they're probably used to like weird startup people. But yeah, like if your friends, like we didn't know how slow our app was on like Samsung Galaxy S until a friend of mine like downloaded it and I was playing with it, and so they had this really weird thing they do with like disk reads and writes, and it was just like awfully slow. And we didn't know until we had a friend who had it. So like definitely like, oh, and also if you have the time, I would definitely suggest investing in like automated testing. There's a bunch of good resources for the frameworks for that. And then also something that we've tried is getting together a beta testing list. So we have like our friends or like users who email us a lot for feedback. We just have like a list of people that every time we have a major release, we'll send it to them. And the first time like 90% emailed us back, and now it's like a little bit lower because I guess they have better things to do. But but it's really helpful because it's actually really real users, and they probably notice things that you don't because you've been developing on it every day. Finally, don't take our word for it. There's probably lots of tips and other things that we've missed, and these are just the things that we've found out while we've been working on Pulse for the past year or so. So, you guys have any questions?
What are some of the testing tools or frameworks that you just mentioned? Do you have any in mind?
So we just started building out our automated testing framework, and one thing that's sort of, I guess it's like testing helpful, but not really testing, is RoboJuice. I don't know if any of you guys have used it, but if you're familiar with Juice or like dependency injection, it basically lets you like inject things. So one of the best things is like, oh, well, I won't get too much into it. But basically, RoboJuice, another thing we are using is Robodium, which is sort of a black box functional testing framework. And the idea is that you don't know like anything about the code. So if you get like a login like activity, what you like write your test as is look for the text that says username, and then like enter this text, and you enter like the username, and like look for the text that says password, and enter this, and then like click the button that says login. You wait for it, and then you wait for it to like become idle, and then you can check that it's on the correct activity that you want. So after you log in, probably it'll go to some other activity. So you make sure it's like correctly logged in. So it's sort of like a black box testing framework. But there are like other unit test frameworks. We haven't looked too much into it yet, but yeah.
For unit tests, we've been mostly using JUnit.
Yeah.
And the cool thing about Robodium is it looks like there's a ghost using your app. You just kind of leave it alone, and it starts acting on its own, with running through most of the use cases, and when it crashes, then
You say day unit?
JUnit.
It's like the built-in one.
Could you talk a little bit about what caching strategies you use in your app? Because I think that's pretty cool. You're able to kind of go left and down, and you seem to prefetch a lot of news items and stuff. What did you have to do to get that working successfully on Android?
Yeah, definitely took a lot of iterations. So when we download the images, we store them all on the SD card because it would take up more space than we'd like to on internal memory. And as for actually using the images in the app, we created our own image cache, which is kind of like a hash map that follows like a least recently used strategy. So when you scroll away, the images that were scrolled away get thrown out. And one thing to remember when you're dealing with bitmaps is that they don't get recycled immediately when you lose references to them. You should call recycle on them explicitly. So when we drop it from our cache, we call recycle on the bitmap, because otherwise it'll crash and run out of memory. So we just kind of use a LRU cache for images.
Okay, do you, for making the HTTP request, do you have your own event pool, or did you do anything custom there for the network code, or how does that
We use the network event pool, and we kind of use it to queue up our HTTP requests and kind of deal with all the work methods we have going. And we actually have, I think, 2 of them. And we try to keep mega requests to a minimum, but sometimes it's unavoidable, especially when you're downloading all these pictures from everywhere. So we just queue them up, and they just download one at a time.
So do you have a service that you schedule in the background that comes online periodically to do that? I mean, how did you manage sort of battery and user perceptions of battery usage with that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So we have a service that runs. We also have some user parameters in our settings that can allow users to set certain things like only update when you're on Wi-Fi. So it won't use up your 3G network data. And there's also depends on how frequently you want to do it. And another option that we don't do or are considering is updating only when you're plugged in, because you can know when you're plugged into a charger or not. So that could be a rule where only do computationally expensive things when you're actually plugged into a wall, and otherwise don't.
Yeah. Actually, we ended up having so many of these settings. It was I guess when you want to update, update on Wi-Fi only, or update on, there was the frequency of updates, every hour, 3 hours, every 6 hours, daily, and there were a bunch of other settings that sort of affect battery usage and data usage. And so one of the things we did recently is we just we sort of grouped them into low data, medium data, and high data, just because our users are not going to want to set append settings for saving data. They just want to go like, don't use a lot of data. And so that's just sort of what a user-friendly thing we have.
How does Action Bar works on the mobile phones? You said that you're designing yours custom Action Bars, Action Bar for tablets. So how would that work on just handsets?
The Action Bar?
Yeah.
I mean, so currently we have the old version of the Action Bar, and on the phones as well. So we're sort of redesigning for both phones and tablets in mind. And like a lot of apps do have that, like Facebook, Google Plus, Beluga, are some good examples where they do have the Action Bar. You do have to sort of be selective on what you put on there on the phone because there's not a lot of space.
Yeah, there's a logo, then you have 3 buttons, so it's hard to stack everything.
Yeah. So I've seen some other apps, like what they might do is like, it says Pulse, but then if you go into some other level where you want to say like Pulse and then something else, they'll like shorten it to like P. So it just like makes the logo shorter.
What about the usage of application? There is some track with what features are used and what are not.
We do a few things for logging. We use Flurry for like that sort of thing. But we also have our own backend for like general logging stuff. So we log when people log in, or they like save stories or read stories.
You share some metrics that you use to log features, like when people read the answer. When people go into a story and read it all, when people scroll earlier stories in the day, they log these kind of things.
Yeah, Flurry is pretty useful for things like that because they kind of do a lot of the work for you. So they do kind of like if you apply a parameter to a certain like action, they can give you cool charts on what parameter is most popular. And an example is we have the ability to change pages. So you have up to 5 pages in Pulse. And there's actually 2 ways to change pages. You can either tap on the name of the page, or if you scroll to the bottom, these little arrows come in. And we were wondering, like, are people actually using these arrows? Because now we're just going to take them out because there's no point in keeping it there if no one uses it. And we looked at Flurry, and it turns out like 25% of the page changes are from those arrows. So that's a pretty significant portion, so we decided to leave them in. So you can use these parameters to kind of look at all aspects of your app and just see what the percentages of users are doing this versus that. And it's really cool. And it's as easy as just putting in like a one-line segment.
So, do you use any crash reporting libraries like ACRA on Android, or I can't remember what the name of one is on iOS? And do you find there's many kind of device-specific crashes that happen on Android or anything like that? Could you share what you do with that stuff?
So currently we don't use any third-party. So we tried out a few, and we haven't really decided yet. But right now we just use like the Android Market crash reports, and we also have like people can email us feedback, and then when they go through like the settings and then info to email us feedback, it'll append like their device information, like what API level they're on, what Pulse version they're on, what device they're on. We were thinking about using a third party because the crash reporting on Android Market is not good, or not good, not like, I don't know, the main thing we want to do is see like crashes by version number, and they don't have that, so we actually have to go through and then try to match up, like right after release we try to match up like crashes per week and total crashes for new crashes.
So it's kind of interesting that you mentioned that, because the big problem that we have is like mapping the Android Market crash reports to our internal load tracking report numbers. So I'm actually writing an open source library for ACRA that will also work on iOS as well to aggregate basically crash reports, because we have the exact same problem that you guys do. So I'll send you a link to it.
I'm currently developing just on iOS, and one thing that seems really appealing about Android is the lack of an approval process. So I'm curious at Pulse if you differ in the frequency of updates that you're doing. Are you testing out new features on Android before you port them over to iOS? And also, are you A/B testing at all on Android?
Yeah, so there is a so when you submit an app on iOS for people that have never submitted an app before, it takes like somewhere between like 1 week and a month before it gets approved and like submitted to market, or 1 week and a couple weeks. Whereas on Android, once you upload it, it's there. And for better or worse, it's like, for all I know, it could like crash everyone's phones and we wouldn't know. So there's kind of a trade-off between having someone approve and just releasing it. But we definitely release more frequently on Android, especially when it comes to bug fixes. If there's a crash on iOS and you really need to fix that bug, you still have to go through the approval process. Whereas on Android, you fix the bug and you upload it again, and then it's out there for everyone. So the frequency on market releases on Android is higher. And since it is higher, we do include more kind of experimental features on Android. And one example is the arrows, and see how like it's what the reception is, and if it is, we'll move it into the iOS release too, and otherwise we can scrap it. And so to answer the question, yeah, we do some like Android's kind of like the scout, I guess, because it's more agile in terms of releasing.
Is there a safe place in like they don't have this for updates in iOS, but when you first submit an app, you can use promo codes to test it through the store before it's live. Is there a similar feature on Android? Or once you put it up, it's up?
Once you put it up, it's up.
Yeah.
We've been thinking of adding like a separate app that's like Pulse Beta, and so people who are like adventurous can use it, and they can't complain too much. But we need like feed syncing and like stuff like that, so that you can report feed syncing, like to sync your feeds with your account. And so we're working on that, and then once that's out, we'll probably revisit and see how that goes.
Do you guys have a sense of how frequently people update to the latest version on Android versus iOS? Or?
Yeah. On iOS, I think it's actually pretty good. The majority would update within a week. On Android, it's kind of maybe double that. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but after about every time you release an update, there's always going to be some proportion that are still going to be in the old version. Like, we actually can track and flurry and just see how it stacks up. Like, the more releases you have, the less people you have on the most recent version, which kind of sucks. So that's kind of a deterrent to releasing too many updates, even if you want to do bug fixes. It's better to kind of wait and roll all the bug fixes into one bug fix update rather than keep releasing them. But I think on iOS, the upgrade is slightly higher, and less on Android.
Can you talk about like what's in your roadmap going ahead apart from kind of UI tweaks you kind of preview there? Is there any kind of thing that you're going to do that's beyond news aggregation, like polls, or any other kind of features you can kind of talk about, or is that all top secret?
We can talk about it.
So, go ahead.
So what we're working on right now is we've kind of just released a Pulse.me service where kind of like save stories to an account. They can read your stories on the web. So if I start like a story that I like, but I don't feel like reading them, I can go home and read it when I have more time. And we're also to add on to that concept of like a personal identity for allowing you to like sync your feeds to your account. So if you have like an iPad and an Android phone, you can have the same sources across both, which right now you can't. And once we have that, you can sort of like reinstall the app and get all your old sources. And nowadays, we also are realizing that a lot of people are using Pulse and a lot of their friends are using Pulse. So we want to kind of see, it's kind of interesting to see if I come across a story and maybe Gene's read it, but I never actually like talked about it, but I can see like, oh, your friend Gene read the story. And it's a really interesting story. I mean, you can start a conversation like, hey, I see you read this. Like, what do you think about Michael Arrington launching a new crunch fund and other topics of the day? So we're trying to bring like the news experience into a more interpersonal experience.
Like more, I guess more like adding a level of engagement on top of like pure consumption, where it's just like you consume the content and then it's like done.
What do you guys recommend as the ratio of emphasis between Android and iOS for somebody who sort of wants to launch both and hasn't launched either yet, in terms of like market size for you guys or ease of getting it out there?
So I think It depends on the kind of app, but it might be easier to get noticed in the. If you're a really good game, you probably get noticed better in the Android market versus iPhone. Whereas if you're a paid app, you would probably get more traction on iPhone than Android because your users are much more likely to pay for an app in iOS versus Android.
Android users actually.
Well, they're even custom to free apps everywhere, so there's no real reason to pay for something when you can find like 10 others that would do the same thing for free. Whereas it's not as true on iPhone because they've been accustomed to paying for apps. So.
I think one thing is like a lot of the apps on Android are really, like they just use the default everything and the default stuff is just really ugly. And so if you put in the effort to like either, you know, if you're good at design or if you hire like a designer and it looks beautiful and looks nice to use, like it definitely gets attention because people don't expect it.
Well, what do you see as the ratio between those two ecosystems? Like for number of clients that you guys put in?
It's about split, I think.
Yeah, it's almost 50-50 actually, which is kind of surprising.
But Android has grown a lot.
Yeah.
Because we used to be just an iPad and iPhone, and Android sort of caught up.
So, you know, one of the things that I'm kind of curious about is development costs in between the two platforms. For a lot of apps, you know, you see both in iOS and Android, they're kind of like glorified web pages being wrapped up. But your app is a pretty meaty app that does a whole bunch of different stuff on the back end and on the actual client things there. I mean, you know, in terms of development time and QA time and all that, I mean, which is the more expensive platform, would you say? Would you make that call?
In terms of like number of people we have working on it, we have more people on Android versus iOS. Because on iOS you support the iPhone and the iPad, whereas Android you support like a bajillion devices, and it takes a lot of time to actually test and make sure it's like not crashing. And when it does crash on this random device, you need to figure out why. So we have come across some really interesting cases where it would only crash on. There's this very obscure field we forgot to set somewhere, and so those things also eat up some resources. But
I think we have more people not by choice, but that we haven't like hired. Like we want to hire more iOS.
That's it. Yeah. It's also really hard to hire iOS developers.
It's hard to hire.
Yeah, it's hard to hire. Period.
So, do you have more developers then working on the Android client, or is it mainly just QA, both, compared to the iOS client?
Do we have what?
You know, like in terms of the actual people developing the app, not just the testers, is it like more Android heavy than iOS at the moment?
Yeah, so we have 3 full-time, and then we had an intern that's sort of, he's going to be working until the end of the year. So we have 4, and we had 2 iOS interns and then 2 full-time, but the 2 interns left. So right now we have 2 full-time iOS.
One of the interns is going back.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and we don't have to like test. We just test it. So.
Speaking of hiring, I'm just curious now, how did you guys get hired? How did you hook up with Pulse?
How do we get started?
Yeah.
So the 2 co-founders, Akshay and Ankit, started Pulse at Stanford through the Launchpad class, and I was actually project partners with those 2 last fall for a different class. And I helped them like test the app, give them the feedback, and at the end of the year, they're like, "Hey, Albert, we're going to start a company. Want to join?" And then I said, "Okay, that sounds pretty awesome." And then so I joined them.
And I joined last November, so I was previously at Google, and then I left early last year. And then I had met the 3 of them at like a sort of entrepreneur meetup night that a friend of ours threw. And then I was sort of working for myself, but later I was looking for like consulting opportunities, and I got back in touch with them, and then they said, "Why don't you just like come work as a consultant for a week, and you know we'll see how it goes." And so I did that, and then I liked it so much I wanted to join full time, so it worked out. And actually, we've sort of we don't really do whole week like trial periods anymore, but one of the things we do like to do is to give candidates a project, even if it's like 3-4 hours, because we feel like that really lets them like show us what they can do like when they're you know at their computer with their tools and their development environment. So we don't really usually, we don't do like the, algorithmic puzzler type whiteboard coding interviews that a lot of companies do.
Yeah. I think Gene likes to say whiteboard interviews just tell you how good they are at coding on whiteboards.
Yeah.
We do the same thing as we do.
So, I mean, if you work with them for a day, you can usually get a really good deal.
I really like the app. Stupid question. How does Pulse make money?
That's a very good question. So we are currently, we raised venture funding not too long ago, and that's given us a pretty long runway, especially since our costs we're a pretty small team, so we're pretty efficient. And we have a really high user engagement and something that we're trying to build. So we will eventually be exploring ways to make money. So for example, there's a lot of publisher interest in getting their app featured in Pulse, or their feed featured in Pulse, mainly because they've seen our user growth and they started realizing that their current models of business aren't really working out that well for them. So they've been contacting us, seeing if they can try to work together and maybe get their feed featured in Pulse in exchange for money or something. But we haven't done that yet, but there's a lot of opportunities that we feel like we can explore.
Sort of experimenting with a few different features.
How many users do you have?
Let's see, our previous disclosed number was we reached over 5 million in June, somewhere around there.
Would you be able to share the percent iOS versus Android?
I think it's around 50-50 split. Yes.
How do you manage your product roadmap? Are you building the same features concurrently on Android and iOS?
That's a good question. Since we're such a small team, when we plan features or where we think the product should go, we can all kind of get together in the same room. And we do want a cross-platform experience to be the same. So if you're a Pulse user on you should be somewhat familiar on Android phone and vice versa. So right now we're trying to make sure our releases are kind of in sync with each other. So our previous release, we actually waited on the Android APK until the iPhone was approved by the market before we actually released it to the market, so we could release them at the same time. So that kind of helps us to get another week of testing.
How do you, since you have different teams working on the two platforms, how do you ensure that you're not effectively just doing the same thing in different languages?
We try to push, if there's anything that makes sense to push to our backend team, we'll do that. So, previously we were downloading the images, and there would be big images, and then we'd resize them for the tile. And we're doing that on the client side for iOS and Android. And recently, we pushed some feeds to our backend. So our backend team actually, they do the resizing and they just send us back the URL for the correctly sized image. And so we don't have to do that on the client side. So, it's not some people, I guess some companies use those platforms where you write it once and then it deploys. But I don't really know what the quality is like for those. So, you are doing a lot of the same thing on iOS and Android.
Yeah, I guess you talked about having, a couple of thread pools running your HTTP clients and doing downloading. You've got to do effectively the same thing with different classes on iOS. Have you figured out any ways to team working together so that
we have a very open communication, so we mostly just talk about our strategies, the high level strategies. So we make sure they're both, so if we're both doing something different, we talk about, try to argue which one's better, and then we decide, oh, okay, this one is better, and then we both do it. But the actual implementation comes down to the person's platform, because that person knows best on how to implement it.
Although we're also working on a catalog redesign, and we have sort of thrown around the idea of doing it as a web view. So, just having all the code as a web code somewhere.
So I think we're coming close to closing time. I'd like to thank Albert and Gene for the amazing. Afterwards, I'll be going down to House of Shields and have a drink. I don't know if any guys are interested in joining us, but that's where Me and Nan will be integrating some other people. So there you go. Thank you all for coming in tonight.
Thank you.